Good afternoon, everybody. As I see that we have folks starting to roll in, we're just going to go over some housekeeping issues here really quickly. My name is Kimberley Petz, and I am one of the assistant directors in employer services here at CalSTRS. And today I have my co-host with me, Joycelyn Martinez-Wade, and she and I will be going through the agenda with you and introducing our speakers. If we could get the slide up that talks about how to interact with the webinar. We are in a Zoom webinar, so it's a little different than a regular Zoom meeting. If this is your first Zoom webinar with us, you will be able to see all of the panelists and our lovely faces up on screen, and we can see that you're all in the room with us. If you have a question, we do have a great Q&A on the bottom of your screen that you can utilize. It's possible that the either speaker at the time or one of our facilitators will either answer the question in writing or will read it out loud and answer it publicly if we think that it is something that everyone needs to hear about at that time. If you want to speak, you can actually use the raise your hand feature on your toolbar as well, and we will get you unmuted and call on you specifically. And if you are one of our call-in participants, which we usually have a few every time, you can still utilize the advisory committee at CalSTRS.com, and we do have that mailbox monitored during this entire meeting. And so when those emails come through, the folks that are monitoring that particular box will let us know that there's a question. So if you have any trouble with any of that, any of the Zoom functionality, the email will be the best way to let us know that you have a question. And it looks like our attendees rolling in seems to have slowed down a little bit. So I think, Joycelyn, do you want to get started and introduce the agenda?
Definitely. Thank you all for having me here today. Want to mention here the slide that is up now is where the meeting materials are posted on CalSTRS.com. So if you go there, you'll be able to see the slides that you're seeing today, as well as directives and circulars that have been recently produced. So that's where you can get to everything that you need. Check that out on CalSTRS.com. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's the agenda for today. So we have a legislative update, and then we'll be talking about the governor's executive order on the separation from service requirement, so as it's connected to post-retirement work and retired member activities. And then you'll be able to see a credible compensation training. So this module you would see if you were individually taking that training with the other folks at your location. But today you get it at EAC. So I'm very excited to go through that today. That, of course, as you can see, will be the bulk of today's meeting. And then we'll have the open forum at the end for any questions that you didn't get to ask earlier or any new information that you're looking for. So that is today's agenda. It will be jam-packed, especially toward the end with the training. So I'm looking forward to that. But next slide, please. And again, reminders on how to ask the questions if you have any. And then the next slide. And actually, I get to start off with you all. So I'll stop a couple times to see if you have questions because I have the legislative update. So what happened in 2021 and what our housekeeping proposal is looking like for 2022. So I'll stop in the middle there before I move on. So if we can go to the next slide. You've seen all this legislation before in previous EAC meetings, sometimes more in depth, sometimes listed here. We did include the matrix in the materials that you saw on the website. So if you want to get more of a summary, and you of course can look at them online, or our analyses are also online. These are our sponsored bills, and I will focus on the ones that might affect employers a little bit more, where you might be wondering. AB 539 was signed, we're excited about that, but there's a little impact. And I'm going to skip to SB 634, also signed. CalSTRS housekeeping sometimes does have things that we want to point out for you, but this one was really light and didn't have much that would affect our school districts and community college districts. And I do want to mention for AB 551, our CalSTRS IRA, which would have been an additional offering under our Pension 2 program. The author, unfortunately, won't be moving it forward in 2021. We'll be strategizing on how to approach that in the future. But I did want to mention it because the school employees you are all eligible to participate in pension too. So just a note there on a kind of a personal side of things, but that is our sponsored legislation. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. And then here comes the laundry list of bills that our board took positions on. I'm going to focus on SB 294 and anything that's been signed. We're in the midst of organizing implementation on that. I think everything has a January 1st effective date. Some of these are permissive. So that will all be determined as we embark on implementation. But on this page, I want to point out SB 294, which eliminated the 12-year service credit limit for elected officers who are on leaves. And so the law, before it is being changed by this bill on January 1st, limited the amount of service credit someone could earn as an elected officer on a leave of absence to 12 years of service credit. That is being removed as of January 1st. So in the future, if you have anyone who's on a leave because they've been elected and they're to be president of their union or whatever it might be, they can do that for more than 12 years now. If someone went over that limit in the past and they had to stop contributing to CalSTRS, they can also look to get that time back if you have anyone who might be in that boat. The contributions will have to come in. There's some interest that's required by the bill. There'll obviously be more information coming out to you. I think this is very much a limited population. We have very few people, it's under 40 basically that we see each year that might be coming in as an elective officer on leave, but I just wanted to point that out. And next slide, please. On this page, I'm going to point out AB 845. Again, very limited application. This has to do with a rebuttable presumption that a COVID-19 illness, if someone's applying for disability, that it was contracted on the job. And there's some requirements around that in the bill. Now, we don't have industrial disability benefits. So it really doesn't matter if somebody got injured or became ill on the job or elsewhere. So no impact there. The only place that it could matter, and this is just for your information in case someone asks you, but if someone has less than 5 years of service, if they had contracted an illness on the job, they may be able to purchase other service that they have out there in order to get to the 5 years to qualify for a disability benefit. So again, very narrow circumstances. Just want to make sure you heard it. So in case a question pops up, you know that you can get in touch with us and learn more. And the member can too. This is really probably coming from the member side of things, but in case you get questions on it. And next slide, please. So then I'm going to move on to 2022, but wanted to see if there was any questions on legislation from 2021 first. If you want to raise your hand or type in the Q&A. Okay, not seeing any right now. So for 2022, we are planning to have our annual housekeeping proposal, and I'll pause for a moment and say right now we don't have any substantive proposals that we're presenting. And so we'll be keeping an eye on anything that's introduced as issues come up. If something we need to work on happens, we'll make sure to keep you posted. But right now we're just looking at the housekeeping proposal. And again, it's pretty light. It won't have much impact to school districts and community college districts and county offices of education, but I want to make sure you know about it in case you have any questions. So I'm going to start with the first bullet. And this has to do with the emergency revolving fund that we have that payments can be made out of. And they really are for limited circumstances. So upon death, and there is a portion in there that 75% of the return of the balance of accumulated retirement contributions has to be paid conditionally as a result of employment termination or death. Now, the other pieces have to do with receiving that benefit already or death. So the conditions are pretty clear. And so we're just clarifying some punctuation on this one to make sure it's clear that those conditions apply to the return of contributions and interest. Again, very technical in nature. Trustee service for cash balance participants. And what's interesting now is that most of these other provisions I'm going to talk to you about are on the cash balance benefit program side of things. And I know that's rare amongst the folks that usually attend EAC that they offer cash balance. I just want to make sure you know about it again. And under cash balance, trustees are actually allowed to participate if the employer has decided to offer cash balance. We are just clarifying that trustee service isn't reliant on being certified or having certification qualifications under the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, because it's not something that gets certified. People run for office they get onto the board of trustees or the school board, again, they're not being qualified by the CTC. And the way the law is laid out, it just might confuse that a little bit. So I want to make that clear. Next slide, please. Also for cash balance on terminating service before they draw down a benefit, we want to be clear that if somebody has both cash balance and defined benefit, they've stopped working, they're only drawing down their defined benefit, retirement benefit, and they want to start drawing down their cash balance benefit, and they are working after retirement, they don't have to stop that work to draw down their cash balance benefit. As you know, people have to stop working completely before they draw down a benefit, and that's active credible service. They do not have to stop the retirement member activities if they're in this rare case where they may have both a defined benefit account and a cash balance account. So again, just clarifying that retirement member activities can continue if somebody wants to newly activate their cash balance benefit. And then next is on the CB death benefits. Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Next bullet. The CB death benefit beneficiaries, we're making it clear what entities, in addition to people, that a cash balance participant can name as their death benefit beneficiary. And so corporation, trust, charitable organization, parochial institution, public entity. And this is exactly the same as the defined benefit program. So clarifying that there's some language currently in the law that may seem to limit those choices, and we don't want that to be a confusing point to people. And then last but not least, we're clarifying some terminology and some phrasing to make sure it's allowable to have electronic submission of documents. Sometimes it says that things have to be accepted into the system or received by the system headquarters office. And really, we're accepting documents into the system via SO or whatever mechanism it is, my CalSTRS. And so we want to make clear that that's always an option since we're moving more in that direction. And I'll stop there and see if there's questions about any of the 2022 housekeeping. Again, pretty arcane, pretty limited in nature, likely not as much applicable since a lot of it is on cash balance. Okay.
I don't see any.
Excellent. Well, if anything comes up, we'll be here till the end. And then I want to take the opportunity to move on to the next topic. So next slide, please. And we're going to be talking about the governor's executive order that streamlined the process for requesting a separation from service exemption. Separation for service exemption for post-retirement work in the most recent 180 days after retirement. And so that executive order touched on the separation from service requirement and not the annual post-retirement earnings limit. And then Beth Ruggiero is here with the details on that executive order. We know there may be lots of questions, so she's going to get into that and the resources that are available. So I'll hand it over to Beth.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, my name is Beth Ruggiero, and I'm here to talk about all of the changes that have taken shape due to that executive order that was issued in August as it pertains to that 180-day separation from service exemption process. And I have to say, first of all, I've worked with a lot of you guys on these requests, and I appreciate all of the questions that you have been asking when the change first came out and the patience that you've afforded us as we get through all these forms. I really appreciate it. So the order itself provided a little administrative relief for you, removing the requirements of obtaining the governing body's approval and the submission of the resolution. We do still require the following 4 requirements be met though. The retiree must meet the normal retirement age, which is 2%, which is 60 at 2% at 60 members and 62 for our 2% at 62. They cannot have received any financial inducement from any public employer, which includes our CalSTRS retirement incentive program. The appointment must be a critical need, and the retiree cannot be backfilling the job in which they retired from. So if you're considering the exemption request, please know that we need to receive this form prior to the retiree performing those post-retirement activities. We cannot accept backdated exemption start dates. Based on law, the retiree should not start working until we receive that required documentation. We do have 30 days to review and provide that determination for the exemption request. And I know a lot of you guys, these positions are critical. That's the whole reason for you submitting these. But I need to let you know we are taking closer to that 30 days because of the crazy increase that we've received recently, up to a 1,400% increase. So we are taking closer to that 30 days of review. The submission of this form does not constitute immediate approval. You will receive, so once we do our evaluation, whoever is listed in section 3 of the form, the employer that's listed there, that's who the approval or denial letter will go to, depending on the results of our evaluation. The member, the retiree, will also get a copy of that exact same letter, in case you're wondering. So they will be getting the exact same confirmation or denial in some cases. When you submit these requests, I do please stress, please request or please provide that annual salary on the form. I know that a lot of you guys are picking up substitutes where they're mainly paid on an hourly basis, but if you can annualize that salary, I would really appreciate it when you submit those. As of right now, we cannot accept electronic signatures on this form, so please submit them with wet signatures. If you are faxing these forms in or emailing them into the post-retirement mailbox, which is completely fine, that is completely fine if it's a scanned signature. The requirement section, section 4 on the form, should be reviewed and initialed only by the employer, not the retiree. We have received quite a few of these forms where the retiree is trying to provide that certification, but that is for you to provide for us. Some common reasons that we have had to deny requests is if the retiree is not in the normal retirement age. And then of course, if the employers are requesting that backdated exemption start date. So those have been the most common reasons why we've had to kick some of those back to you. Some helpful resources for you. I know that we've posted the announcement on SO the day after the executive order was issued, which has some very general information. On our .com website, we also do have our employer directive that was updated as well. There has been some questions submitted to our CEO. And so there's questions and answers under the Ask CEO section of the CalSTRS website in addition, if that can be of any help. With that, I will open it up to any questions.
I don't see any raised hands, Beth.
Knocked it out of the park, did I?
You did. You just have it all lined up for them.
Nicely done.
No
Well, they've been doing a
Q&As
great
either,
job.
so. All right, great. Thank you, Beth, so much. And I know if anyone has any further questions, they can reach out to you. And we can also have a conversation in the open forum if something comes up. So go ahead and let us know. And I believe that puts us with our next item on the agenda, which is Employer Services' very own Leanna Friedrich doing her amazing training on creditable compensation. So Leanna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. That's quite the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to pull up my presentation here. And so just give me 1 second. You may notice that the screen will go black for a second. That's okay. It'll fix itself in a minute, but we'll let that transfer over. But in the meantime, good afternoon, everybody. All right, I think it just transferred over. Should look good. Should be seeing the correct screen. Okay, awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leanna Friedrich, and I'm one of the trainers here on the training and development team. And with me today is Megan Wallach, who is the training manager. And we're here to talk to you about credible compensation. So Megan will be monitoring the Q&A. So if at any point you have any questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A. And I'll also be pausing throughout the presentation today to, of course, give you some time to write out some questions and then answer that might come up. But I'm really excited today to show you our brand new credible compensation training. So of course, all the information is the same, but we've been really working hard to update it to make it something that is useful for you. As you probably know, if you've been through any of our trainings, we really appreciate send out a survey for all of our instructor-led trainings to find out what worked and your general feedback and ideas. And so this credible compensation training was redesigned with that feedback in mind. So we're definitely really eager to hear your thoughts about it and want to know that we want this to be helpful for you. So at the end of this training, at some point, you'll also receive an email with a link to provide some feedback that we definitely appreciate. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in and talk about creditable compensation, which of course is something that everybody loves to talk about. We always have a lot of questions about it. And when we're thinking about creditable compensation, of course, this is so foundational. We're thinking about those earnings that are reported to CalSTRS each month for active employees. And I do want to mention that today's training is going to be focused active employees. If you have any questions about working after retirement or working with retirees, we definitely have a lot of materials related to that on our Pension Administration and Learning Management System, also known as PALMS. And we also have a brand new, recently revised Working After Retirement Job Aid that's posted on the Employer Support Portal. So for those with questions, definitely look at those resources, but for today, we're going to be focusing on creditable compensation for active employees. All right, well, let's. We have a couple of learning objectives. By the end of today, you should be able to explain the principles of creditable compensation. We'll talk about those principles. They really are the foundation here, and we'll talk about what they are and why they're important. You'll also be able to identify the conditions for compensation to be creditable. So what exactly makes something creditable compensation? What does it need to be in order to be that? We'll talk about the differences between salary and special pay. So these are two things that we're all very familiar with. And so we'll discuss those differences and how to tell the difference between the two. And then we'll also talk about annualized pay rate. And so by the end of today, you'll be able to apply the appropriate annualized pay rate in the context of creditable compensation. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in to that very first objective and focus on the principles of creditable compensation. So this is something, like I said, that's really critical, and that's because creditable compensation is the basis on which these benefits are calculated. So it's really important that compensation be treated consistently. That's why we treatment of compensation. Our principles focus on that consistency in a couple of different ways here. So throughout a member's career, we want to make sure that members aren't being treated differently, right? We want to make sure that everything is consistent with the years used to calculate their final compensation for retirement. We also want to make sure that things are higher class of employees. We'll talk about class of employees a little bit later in the presentation, but we want to make sure people who are performing similar duties are being paid equitably. And then lastly, we want to make sure that there's consistent treatment for a position. We want to make sure a position isn't treated differently depending on who is in that position. So all components make consistent treatment of compensation, and you'll hear this echoed throughout the training today as we're talking about creditable compensation. Now, speaking of creditable compensation, before we jump into the details here, I do want to mention some other things that creditable compensation can include. So the first of which is any compensation for the use of leave of an employer-approved leave of absence. So some common examples of this might be sick leave, vacation leave, etc. It also can include member contributions that are picked up by the employers, as well as any amounts that are deducted from an employee's compensation. So for example, health benefits, parking, compensation, and contributions, etc. So all of those things may be included in creditable compensation. There are a few things though that are excluded. And so credit payments, including any compensation paid for the relinquishment of unused leave. So common examples of this could be a cash out of vacation or overload or employment termination. It also excludes fringe benefits. And I'm getting a note, the internet is a little unstable, so if you need me to repeat anything, feel free to let me know at any points. But as we're talking about fringe benefits, some examples of this be cash in lieu of health benefits or a car or allowance. And then lastly, reimbursement to provide or reimbursement based on employer paid expenses. So this could be classroom supplies or expenses. And so I'll go ahead and pause here just to see if we have any questions. It looks like I'm getting a note that the audio is cutting out occasionally. Thanks, Erica, for letting me know. If you notice that this continues to happen, please feel free to pass that along. not quite sure. What's
Leanna,
happening? Yeah.
I hid my video just to give you a little bit more bandwidth because I know sometimes that helps. And we do have another trainer on standby. If your audio freezes up or gets really bad, we'll have another trainer take over in case your internet's a little spotty.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, thanks for letting us know, and continue to let us know how the audio is working. Okay. Oh, okay, so it looks like we have a question here. What were some of those examples of relinquished leave? Yep, so some examples of this might be a cash out of vacation or overload credits at retirement or employment termination. So payments related to that are going to be excluded from creditable compensation. All right, so let's go ahead and dig a little deeper here into creditable compensation. And so as we go through this training, you'll notice a series of questions, and we're calling these key questions or guiding questions to help you think about how to approach creditable compensation. So now that we know the principles and we've talked about the types of creditable compensation or payments associated with creditable compensation, the first question you'd want to ask yourself is, does the compensation meet the conditions to be reportable? There are 5 conditions that we're going to discuss today, and if this payment doesn't meet these conditions, it's not creditable compensation and therefore should not be reported. So what exactly are these conditions? The very first one here is going to be paid for the performance of creditable service. So creditable service is something we're all familiar with. It's performing that can be covered by CalSTRS. I won't go into too much detail here about what constitutes a creditable service, but we do have a lot of resources on Palms as well as the employer support portal that talk about creditable service in depth. The second condition is that it's paid in accordance with a publicly available written contractual agreement. So some examples of this might be a salary schedule, an employment agreement, a bargaining unit agreement, or approved board minutes. Now, one question we often get about this one is, what exactly does that mean? Publicly available, does that mean it needs to be on a website? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't have to be on a website, but the documentation should be available upon request. So it has to be available if needed. All right, the third condition here is that the payment is paid to all in the same class of employees. And this is something that we discussed earlier when we were talking about the principles of consistent treatment of compensation. Let's talk what it means when we're talking about classes of employees. So there are 3 ways that you can establish a class of employees, and a class of employees is considered a group because they meet any of these 3 possible ways. It doesn't have to meet all of them, it just has to meet one of these ways. The first is that they're performing similar duties. So similar duties can be really considered those creditable service activities that we discussed before. The paragraphs that are written in Education Code 22119.5 B1 through 9, which is something that we're all familiar with. That's what we're referring to when we're talking about creditable service activities. Similar duties, though, can also mean a couple of other things. The first is that it could be a situation for employees who are performing 2 or more job duties. The key here, though, is that it has to be on one contract. So, for example, a really common one of this would be your teacher librarians. You may have full-time employees who are working 50% teacher, 50% librarian. You could create a class of employees around that as long as it's listed on one contract. And then another way that we see perform similar duties in some cases, there may be a class of just one employee. And for that one, a really common example would be your superintendents. In order for you to establish a class of one employee, you just need to demonstrate that these duties are commonly used by at least 2 other employers in the state of California. So that's our first way of establishing a class of employees based on employment to perform similar duties. The second way here is employment in the same type of program. So there's 2 different ways that this happens. The first would be an educational program that's established pursuant to state or federal law. So for example, you could create a class of employees for your special education teachers, since special education is a program that was established pursuant to state and federal law. The other type of program that we're talking about when we look at the same type of program option is anything or any programs that are established pursuant to the Local Control and Accountability Plan. That's also known as an LCAP for short. So for example, you might have a class of teachers who are teaching dual immersion language classes because that's part of the LCAP. Last way you can establish a class of employees is based on similarities related to the nature of work. And if you're like me and you looked at this for the first time and you were trying to think about what exactly does that mean, similarities related to the nature of work, this particular way is designed for flexibility where needed. So if you have a group of employees that you're not quite sure, you think it might fit under this third option here, similarities related to the nature of work, this is a situation where you'd contact us at CalSTRS to see if this employee would fall under this category. Now, I'm really excited to share that we do have a class of employees, CBT or computer-based training, that's coming out by January. So if you feel like you need a couple of additional resources related to class of employees, definitely check that out. We'll communicate with you once that is finalized and ready to go. But in the meantime, there's also a job aid related to class of employees on the employer support portal. All right, so let's go back to our conditions here. I don't see any questions so far, but I'll just give it a minute, a couple of seconds if anyone is typing things out before we talk about the last two conditions. Okay, so let's talk about the fourth condition here. And this one is special. You might notice on the screen here, there's this little note in parentheses that makes all the difference. And that is the condition that things are paid each pay period that creditable service is performed. This is only going to be applied to our DD 2% at 62 members. So that's what makes this one special here. If you have any questions about how to determine an employee's benefit structure, we will also have a new benefit structure computer-based training course that is in the works and being worked on right now. Again, we'll communicate with you once that one is ready to go, but there's a job aid about benefit structures as well that you can look at right now on the employer support portal. But let's talk about this one, because this is one that people often have a lot of questions about because it is really only for that 2% at 62 member group. I'll give you a couple of examples that will help this make a little bit more sense. So let's say here we have Monica, who's at 2% at 60, is teaching summer school in July and August. Monica's contract states that she will be paid in August and in September per the contract. Great, no problems here. This is reportable. It's paid each pay period that creditable service is performed. So what we look at here really is the intent of this particular example. The contract is paid the intent of it is to be paid each pay period that the creditable service is performed. Now you'll notice that the work Monica does in July is paid in August, so there might be some questions about that, but that's okay. If that's how payroll is ran, then that makes it creditable. Again, looking at the intent here. But let's look at an example of something that's not paid each pay period for our 2% at 62 member. So again, Monica's teaching summer school in July and August. But this time her contract is saying that she will be paid in a lump sum in September per the contract once the work is done. This would not be reportable because it's not paid each pay period that creditable service is performed. The contract intent is that she's paid in a lump sum in September, so therefore not reportable, not creditable. And she will need to be paid pursuant to this contract. The employer can't issue or report the monthly payment differently than the contract to make it reportable in this case. Now, let me throw a little bit more in this example. So again, we have Monica, who 2% at 62, again, teaching summer school, July and August. And this time, let's add Ben to the mix. So Ben is 2% at 62, also a teacher, but he's just teaching in August. Per their contract, Ben and Monica are paid in a lump sum in September. That's what the contract stipulates. Again, this is not going to be reportable for either Monica or Ben because it's not paid each pay period that creditable service was performed. Now, looking at this at first glance, it might seem like it would only be creditable for Ben since he's working in August and he's getting paid in September that next month. But again, it goes back to what is the intent of the contract? And in this contract, the intent is that they are paid in a lump sum once in September. So it's not going to be creditable for either teacher here because they are 2% at 62 members. All right, so I'll give you a moment to look that over and see. It looks like we have a couple of questions coming in. And it looks like Megan was able to answer a question about this rule apply to all 312s and CCDs. And the answer to there is yes, all 2% at 62 members have to be paid each pay period. That does not rely on their employer or where they're employed at. It's just the rule for their benefit structure, the 2%. All right, and it looks like Megan's working on an answer to that other question here. And so we'll circle back and talk about that one shortly. Okay, so the fifth condition here is if after we know that it's met conditions 1 through 4, the very last condition is it has to meet the requirements of either salary or special pay. And so we're going to talk about the differences between those two items and what those requirements are. All right. We've got some questions coming in. I'm going to keep moving on and then I will pause a couple slides later and then we'll address some of those questions that Megan's working on. All right, so looking at salary versus special pay here. So this is a topic that we talked about in our objective slide, understanding how to differentiate between these two things. So let's start with salary. So salary is going to be the compensation that's paid directly for creditable service in a position or for the performance of additional creditable service. And that's a really important key component here, that salary is always going to be tied to the performance of service. On the other hand, we have special pay, which is compensation paid in addition to salary for meeting a specific requirement. And you'll notice that it's full or laid out in this slide here that special pay cannot be paid for the performance of additional service. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about some of the terminology being used referring to this as special pay. This is something that is also known as remuneration paid in addition to salary in the law. And then it's also known as special compensation in our current system. So we're moving forward going to be using the term special pay because that's what is going to be used in the new system. And so because it's going to be used in the new system, all of our training materials are going to be adapted to use that term special pay. All of these terms, however, are referring to the same exact thing. All right. Now, before we jump in, I do notice there are some questions coming through in the Q&A, so if you can take a brief moment to take a look. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like there was a question about a community college district paying $25 an hour for part-time faculty to attend department meetings, and Megan was able to answer that one. And again, talking about the intention, right? If the intent is to pay them each pay period, then that's acceptable. If the intent is to delay, then that would be something that would not be creditable. So there's a lot of detail in that one, so make sure you take a look if you have any questions on that one. Okay, let's see.
Hey, Leanna, can I jump in real quick?
Yes,
So
please.
we've got
Thank you, Megan.
a couple questions and I'll type them out, but just so I don't
Yes.
delay in typing. Very similar questions. So we're really looking at the intent. So we've gotten some questions about submitting requests for payments. It sounds like the CCDs where you have some part-time folks and they submit those. If the intent is to pay them each pay period, we would allow that. If you're simply not paying them until later in a lump sum because they failed to submit timesheets or documentation, or maybe there was an administrative error or an oversight, we wouldn't hold the member accountable for that. We would still accept that payment as paid each pay period, and you'd be able to report that. But if the practice or intent is that they get paid at a lump sum at the end of the period or quarter or what have you, that would not be considered paid each pay period. So I hope that clarifies. I'll go ahead and still type those answers out so you have it in writing, but it might take me a minute because there's a couple that are very similar.
Great, thank you, Megan. Okay, looks like we're getting a lot of questions about the situation with Ben. So let me go back to that slide here just so I can pull it up. And then Megan, feel free to jump in here too, because I know there was a couple of questions about this one if you wanted to answer those live as well. But I'm going to take a look at some of these questions related to this situation. So when we're talking about a lump sum payment, we're talking about a payment that's not, it's not paid each pay period that the service is performed, right? That's not the intention. It's the idea that it's paid a lump sum, usually after the work is completed. Megan, am I missing anything on that one?
No, that's exactly right. And Talina, sometimes the contracts don't say, they just say you get, for example, $1,000 master stipend, and it doesn't say whether it's paid monthly or if it doesn't provide the details on how it would be paid, then we would rely on the employer to make that determination. So if you're cutting checks monthly for that and that's the intent, then that would be okay. But if you're cutting the checks in a lump sum at the end of the school term or what have you, then that would not be acceptable. So ideally the contract is specifying whether it's paid each month or if it's paid in one installment at the end of a term. But if it doesn't provide that specification in the contract, we would verify on the employer to tell us that information and make that determination.
Megan. And Curtis, I think that touches on your question as well. You know, really looking at the contract, if Ben's contract didn't state he'd be paid in a lump sum, but paid monthly. Again, if you're cutting checks monthly, that's the intention, then that is considered, you know, paid each pay period. That's appropriate. But again, looking at the intent of the contract. So hopefully that answered your question as well, Curtis.
Yeah, so if you're only, and I think we have an example of that. So if you're only performing service in 1 month and that happens to be the month where a lump sum check is cut, that's not the intent of pension reform. So that payment wouldn't be creditable. It would have to be, we're looking at the characteristic as the payment of a whole. So that in Curtis's example, if I'm following it correctly, that would not be creditable.
Okay, thanks, Megan. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to keep moving forward so that we can talk about, so we were just discussing salary versus special pay, and so some of the differences, again, touching on how one of the main signifying details here is that salary is paid for creditable service. Special pay is compensation paid in addition to salary, and it cannot be paid for the performance of additional service. And we also talked about how moving forward, we're going to be using the term special pay, but that's referring to remuneration paid in addition to salary and special compensation. They're all referring to the same thing. It's just that in special pay, that's what's being used in the new system. So therefore, that is what is going to be used in our trainings. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about special pay, because even within special pay, there's also the distinction between ongoing special pay versus limited term special pay. And so this is something just to make sure we clarify before we jump into some of these details here. So really what it comes down to with special pay is thinking about the availability of that payment and how that determines which account the money gets credited to. So to determine whether something is considered ongoing or limited term, focus on that availability of the payment. So ongoing payments are available on an ongoing basis, right? They can be a lump sum payments for our 2% at 60 members. And this is going to go to DB. So ongoing special pay, the availability is there for it to be happening on an ongoing basis. The biggest difference here, though, is with limited term payments. So with limited term payments, these are payments that have a specified end date, they're paid a certain number of times, or they're not otherwise scheduled to continue. And that is something that distinguishes this from these ongoing payments. If they have a specified end date, if they have a certain number of times they're being paid, or if there's no reason or if they're not otherwise scheduled to continue, this counts as a limited term payment. It doesn't have to be all three. Sometimes we get that question. It just has to meet one of these requirements in order to be considered a limited term payment. Now, limited term payments are only going to be creditable for DD 2% at 60. And that's because if we think about limited term payments, they're not paid each pay period that creditable service is performed, right? They have that specified end date, or they're only paid a certain number of times, or they're not scheduled to continue. So that's why they're never going to be creditable for our 2% at 62 members because of their limited term status. And these are also special because they go straight to DBS. They're credited to the DBS account. Now, sometimes questions come up with reporting a stipend. So oftentimes we think of stipends as special pay, but they actually can be salary items as well. Whenever you are encountering a stipend, the question to ask yourself here is this compensation paid directly for creditable service or for the performance of additional service? And if the answer is yes, then it has to meet the requirements of salary, right? Because salary is always going to be associated with service. But if the answer is no here, then it has to meet the requirements of special pay. Because special pay is not paid for service, for additional service. Now, let's play a quick little game here as just to test ourselves and see how much we know about salary or special pay. So I'm going to give you a scenario and I want you to think to yourself, would you evaluate this as being salary or as being special pay? So the first scenario here is that Phoebe's earning $60,000 for being a full-time counselor at Buffet Charter School. Would you evaluate this as salary or would you evaluate this as special pay? And feel free to just think to yourself and test your knowledge here. And the answer is salary, right? We're looking at, this is her salary for the work she does, the service she performs as a full-time counselor at the charter school. Here's your second scenario here. Phoebe also earns $1,000 for having a bilingual certificate. Would you evaluate this as salary or as special pay? And if you thought to yourself, special pay, you would be exactly right. Having a bilingual certificate is not associated with the performance of additional service. We'll actually talk about this one a little bit later, but you would evaluate it as special pay. And then last scenario here, Phoebe also earns an additional 4% of her counseling salary for being head counselor. And I'll give you a hint, being head counselor is associated with additional service. So would you evaluate this as salary or as special pay? And if you said salary, you would absolutely be correct. So being head counselor is associated with additional work, right? Additional service. So therefore you would need to evaluate this as salary. All right, speaking of salary, the next part of our training is to discuss what are the requirements of salary. So once we know that this should be evaluated as salary, the next question to ask yourself is, does this compensation meet those requirements? And I'll give a brief pause here because I know there are some questions coming in. Just take a look and see. Allison, we're going to talk about class size overage, so stay tuned on that one. It depends, and we'll talk about that one. Awesome. Cindy, thanks for participating. Patricia, thanks for participating. Ramona, great question. So you're wondering about the 4% head counselor pay. That one, we'd have to look at a position description it's really just an example, but if we were to hypothetically say it would probably be a part-time assignment. But Megan, did you have anything to add on that one?
I do not.
Okay, sorry. No worries. Okay, all right, so kind of looking at this one, anything else? Perfect. Yeah. So Ramona, it would probably be a part-time assignment. It depends on the work that's being performed there, but we would definitely take a look at that if assistance was needed. But good point about how sometimes they don't have duty statements. It's a good point. All right. So let's talk about salary. So does this meet the requirements for salary? So there are two requirements to consider here when we're looking at salary. So it has to meet both of these. The first is that it needs to be explicitly characterized as salary. And the second is that it needs to be used as the basis for future pay increases. Now, there are two exceptions to this last piece here, and that is going to be activities that are related to outgrowth and activities that are related to examination, selection, in-service training, mentoring, or assignment of teachers or others in the instructional program. So if it's a payment associated with either of those two things, it doesn't need to be used as the basis for future pay increases. This is because most often these types of payments are paid in stipends, which are usually not used as the basis for future pay increases. So one example of something being used as the basis of future pay increases would be if you had a cost of living adjustment, would that cost of living adjustment affect this payment? That's one example to think about, but of course, if you have any questions on this, happy to discuss this further too. But looking at those requirements of salary, sometimes you might have stipends that are associated with the performance of additional service, but they're not related to outgrowth and they're not related to this mentoring or training component. If they're not used as the basis for future pay increases, they would not meet the requirements of salary and then therefore are not considered creditable compensation. Now, the employer can determine whether a payment is used as a basis of future pay increases. So that is something for the employer to determine there. Now, with salary, let's also discuss annualized pay rates. So when we're thinking about salary, it always needs to be reported with an annualized pay rate so that the service can be credited and that the final compensation can be calculated at retirement. So an annualized pay rate is the salary a person could earn in a school term for the creditable service if it was performed on a full-time basis. It cannot be less than the full-time minimum standard. The full-time minimum standards can be used if you have a position that doesn't have a full-time equivalent, it doesn't already exist. You can use the full-time minimum standards to calculate that annualized pay rate. One resource that I find really helpful is that there is an annualized pay rate job aid, and in that, it's on the employer support portal. In that, they have a list of all the full-time minimum standards for all the different positions. So it's definitely something to keep bookmarked and handy if you need it. Now that we have a good sense of annualized pay rates, let's talk about some common salary items and how you might report those. So let's start with our standard teaching contract assignment. And what would that look like here? So Rachel, we have Rachel who's earning $60,000 full-time teaching salary August to May, and she receives the salary in 12 equal payments from July to June. Now you have two different ways to report this. You can report this as earned or as worked. And so it's up to you to determine what you'd like to do. The law requires that that it's performed as it's earned, but you can determine if it's as earned and worked or if as it's contractually earned here. If you have questions about this, there is the circular that came out in 2018, the paid versus earned. So definitely something to check out if you'd like to refresh on that information. But let's look at the differences between these two here, depending on how you chose to report this. So the top one has it reporting compensation as earned or worked. And so we're looking at assignment code 57. And for the pay rate, since this is being paid as earned over a 10-month school term, we have a pay rate of $60,000. So makes sense, 60 times over 10, or 6,000 times 10 will give us that 60,000 full-time teaching salary. But if you wanted to report this as contractually earned, which is what it says in the description here, over 12 equal payments, we'd have a pay rate of $5,000. Given that $5,000, over 12 months is going to get us to that $60,000 full-time teaching salary. Now let's go over how to report a daily assignment. So for this one, we have our green USD teachers. They're earning $200 a day for attending optional staff trainings. And Rachel decides she's going to attend 1 day training in August. And the base days, just for our reference here for Rachel's teaching position, is 180 days. So how would we report this? The first thing to do would be to calculate the earnings by multiplying that daily rate of $200 a day by the number of days worked. She worked 1 day in August. So that gives us $200 of earnings. The next step would be to calculate her pay rate. So we take that daily rate of $200 a day and we multiply that by her base days, which is 180 days, which gives us a pay rate of $36,000. And if we were to report this, we'd go ahead and use assignment code 55. You'll notice our pay rate is $36,000 with a pay code of 0 to show that it's annual, and her earnings are $200. Now keep in mind that base days cannot be less than the full-time minimum standard for the position. In this case, it is actually more than the full-time minimum standard. Let's talk about how to report an hourly assignment. So hourly is similar to daily, only this time you'll use hourly rate and base hours instead for your annualized pay rate. So we have our USD, green USD teachers. They're earning $30 an hour for staff meetings, and Rachel's attending 3 one-hour staff meetings in August. Her base hours in this case are 1,080 hours. So how would we do this? Same exact process. We'd calculate her earnings. $30 an hour times 3 hours would be $90 for her earnings. We would then take her rate of $30 an hour, multiply that by her base hours for the position, which is 1,080 hours, which gives us a pay rate for this of $32,400. And again, here's our reporting line. We've got assignment code 55 with a pay rate $32,400. You'll notice again, we're using pay code 0 for annual to show her earnings.
Hey, Leanna, can I interject really quick?
Yes.
So we got a good question from Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay, for pointing it out. So for those of you that are from a CCD, you're going to use assignment code 58. Anytime we reference assignment code 55, that's for our larger population of K through 12 employers. But at a CCD, you guys would use assignment code 58. And we can add a footnote to the slides moving forward so that that's more clear for you guys. So thank you for your comment, Lindsay.
Great, thanks, Megan. I'm really glad you brought that up, and thank you, Lindsay. We'll see assignment code 58 pop up a little bit later, so thanks for bringing that one up. Okay, and just like with our daily assignment, the base hours also cannot be less than the full-time minimum standard for that position, though in this case, in this example, it's actually more. Okay, so let's now talk about how you would report a non-time-based assignment. So it's going to be a little bit different here. So when you're looking at a non-time-based assignment, you'll report it using the pay rate for the position the assignment is associated with. And so let's take a look at an example here. So we have Rachel again, $60,000 salary. And her school district is going to issue teachers a $1,000 stipend annually for serving as a mentor to new teachers during that fiscal year. Rachel serves as that mentor and she earns the payment in May. So you would report this compensation using the pay rate for the position that it's associated with. In this case, this is associated with her teaching position. So you'll notice that we're using assignment code 55, but the pay rate is $60,000, and again, using pay code 0 for annual, her earnings stay $1,000. All right, next we're going to move on and talk about a couple of special situations that you may see with reporting. The first of which is an outgrowth assignment. So how would you report outgrowth? For this one, you'll really want to look at all of the creditable service assignments that specific employees performing for the same employer in that fiscal year. So we have Rachel. She's very busy. She's earning compensation that's creditable for her teaching position for those staff meetings and staff trainings for the 2021 fiscal year. She then decides to earn $2,000 in November 2020 as a club advisor. So that is an outgrowth activity. She's earning some additional funds there for her outgrowth performance. Now, how would we report this? So again, we're going to look at the lowest annualized pay rate of all the assignments to report with that outgrowth. And if we take a look at that, that's going to be the $32,400 pay rate. So we'd report this with assignment code 55, using that same pay rate to match the lowest annualized pay rate of the creditable service activities she's performed that fiscal year in order to report this. Now, one thing to note here is that if an employee is performing a creditable service activity with a lower annualized pay rate than the outgrowth was reported with, then you will have to go back and adjust it to match that lower annualized pay rate. In the new system, this process will be automated. So that's something to keep in mind. All right. Another special situation that may come up, and this is for those who are joining us from the community college district, would be something like office hours. So how would you report office hours at a community college district? So for this one, it really depends on whether the hours are required or if they're optional. So let's start if they are required here. So in our situation, we have Chandler, who earns a $60,000 part-time faculty salary, and he's receiving $50 an hour for completing 10 office hours per pay period. Just for our own knowledge, the school term is 525 hours. So if those hours are required, you would just go ahead and include it with the assignment they're associated with. You'll notice here that the pay rate is also increased. So originally he would have had $60,000 for his salary over a 10-month period, but you'll notice that he's earning $50 an hour for 10 office hours. So that is just lumped in and associated with that pay rate since those office hours are required. Now, what happens if they're optional here? If they're optional, then they will report them as separate transactions. So you'll notice we have assignment code 57, and we have a pay rate of $6,000 over 10 months with pay code 3. And then added on to that, we now have assignment code 58. So I told you we'd see it somewhere later in the presentation, assignment code 58 with a pay rate of $26,250. How we got that was multiplying that hourly rate times the school's number of hours in that school term, so 525, with a pay code of 0 for annual to reach that reporting line correctly. All right, so I do see there's a question here about, it looks like Megan's covering. So I think the $1,000 is referring back to that one with Rachel who got paid in May. And in that case, you're correct, it would not be creditable for 2% at 62 because it's a one-time payment. It's not paid each pay period that creditable service was performed. And then Lindsay, looks like you have a question. Can we opt to report as a separate transaction? And so I'll let Megan jump in for that question, for this question there.
On it being reported in a separate transaction?
For Chandler in office hours.
Oh. Either way of reporting is not acceptable. So it would depend because what you're going to do is you're going to be changing the pay rate that then gets used in their final potentially used in their final compensation calculation for retirement. So we will need you to report it either way based on whether or not those office hours are included, are required. So if the office hours are required, then it's part of the full-time equivalent for the position. So it should be included in the pay rate, and that pay rate increase can get them a higher retirement benefit potentially. If those office hours are not required, they're considered an additional assignment, which would create a lower pay rate. You'll see a $6,000 monthly pay rate instead of the $6,500 pay rate. And that $500 would be additional service credit instead of service credit that then goes towards a higher pay rate. So it's really important that this distinction is made and that it's reported one way or another based on whether those office hours are required or not. And we've seen it, it's pretty inconsistent across CCDs we've seen it both ways. So it really depends on how you guys treat those office hours in the contract.
Right. Thank you, Megan. Hopefully that helps. And we'll go ahead and I'll let Megan answer a couple of those other questions in the Q&A, but we're going to keep moving forward and talk about special pay. So now we've covered salary. We've talked about the requirements of salary. We've talked about ways to report salary. And so let's talk about special pay. So just like with salary, there are specific requirements for special pay. So it needs to meet these requirements in order to be creditable. So first of all, with special pay, you've heard us say this before, it's not for the performance of additional service. Additionally, it needs to be paid to all in the class of employees in the same dollar amount, percentage of salary, or amount being distributed. Again, this goes back to those principles of consistent treatment of compensation, right? We want everything to be consistently treated. We've talked about class of employees, so it happens here for special pay as well. And it also needs to be paid in the same manner to all in the class of employees and not available in an alternative format. So I want to talk about this one a little bit more with an example. So let's say, for example, we have a situation where there's excess students in a class and the teacher is given an option of either offering $20 per excess student or a teacher's aide. In that case, it actually would not be creditable because it's available in an alternative format. Even if that teacher decides they're going to take the cash option in that situation, because there is an alternative format available, it's not going to be creditable. So it's really important that things are paid the same manner to all in the class of employees and not available in that alternative format for special pay. And then the last requirement here is that it has to be paid for one of the special pay types. And so we'll go into detail about what that looks like. We've mentioned a couple of them so far in our training, but we'll go into a lot more detail shortly. But before we do that, let's just briefly talk about annualized pay rates for special pay. So when you report special pay, the annualized pay rate and the earnings field must be the same. It must be reported the same, must be the same number. If they're not the same, then you'll actually get an error that will prevent you from submitting your F496 file. Now, there is an exception for reduced workload program earnings, so keep that in mind for that one. But for all others, annualized pay rate should be exactly the same as the earnings field for special pay items. Okay, so let's talk about special pay a little more in detail and the specific types of special pay. So we'll start with one that is probably the most common that we see, which is payments paid for having a certificate, license, or degree. So we saw this earlier. This came up with Phoebe and her bilingual certificates. Now, as they go through these, you'll also notice in parentheses, there is an abbreviation CLDE in this case, and that's referring to the code it belongs to in the new system. So a little preview there, but let's talk about these more in depth with some examples. So for this one, really common, we see this a lot. Some common examples would be master's degree or getting a PhD, national board certification, or that bilingual certification that we saw earlier in one of our examples. Now for this one, this could be ongoing or it could be limited term. It just depends on the contract and how it's written. So keep that in mind. It could be either, it just depends on what the intent was for this one. The next one that we see often is available funding. So this would be payments made, contingent on the availability of funds. Some common examples of this would be one-time off salary schedule payments, lottery pay, or parity pay. One thing to it doesn't mean that the employer only came into the money. It could also mean having money left over at the end of their budget at the end of the year. So that's another example that we sometimes see with this one. And for this one is often going to be limited term, right? Because it's based on that availability of funding. It's not something that is necessarily consistent. So in most cases, this is going to be a limited term payment with a specified end date or paid a number of times or otherwise not scheduled to continue. And if it's a limited term payment, keep in mind it's not going to be reportable for that 2% at 62 members. The next special pay type is longevity. So this would be pay for longevity based on career or service. So for example, this could look like a special payment for 15 years of service with the district, or 20 years of experience as a teacher, or 25 years of experience in education. And for this one, this could be ongoing or limited term. Again, just depends on the contract. The next special pay type we have here is the hiring, transfer, or retirement. And so this is going to be paid contingent on hiring, transfer, retirement. So for example, some common incentives that we might see is maybe you want to offer a hiring incentive to recruit new teachers to your school, or maybe you want to offer a transfer incentive to encourage employees from one school to take a position in another school in your district, or with retirement to encourage employees to retire that year, to incentivize that. So for our hiring or retirement incentives, this needs to be earned while the member is active. So that's just something to keep in mind. For this one, similar to availability of funding, it's often going to be limited term, right? Usually it's a one-time thing to try to incentivize hiring, transfer, retirement. So these are often going to be limited term payments. And if they are limited term, they're not reportable for DD 2% at 62. All right, the next special pay type we have is difficult to staff, and this is paid because it's difficult to staff certain positions. So some common examples would be schools in a high crime or rural area. One that we saw a lot this past year was payments for working in person during the pandemic, and then difficulty staffing STEM teachers is another common example that you might see. For this one, again, it could be ongoing or limited term depending on the contract. All right, excess students, let's talk about this one because this is one that's come up a couple of times so far. So this one, what we're looking at is payment for an excess of students when the full-time is set by time, such as hour or days. So we'll start with that. So when the number of students enrolled exceeds the contractual class maximum. So for example, we have a contractual full-time position that's time-based, so based on hours or days, and these teachers receive an additional $20 a student over 28 students in the class. So for this one, keep in mind that the contract must state the maximum of number of students. So it has to be listed in the contract, and it also has to be listed how much they will receive for going more than the maximum. Now, this one typically is occurring at our K through 12 school districts and not usually at our CCDs or independent study programs. And we'll talk about why that is shortly. But in this particular situation, this could be ongoing or limited term. It just depends on the contract. Now let's talk about those community college districts and independent study programs. So excess students as salary, can it ever be considered salary? And the answer is yes, if the full time is based on a non-time-based measure. And if that's the case, then excess students should be evaluated as salary. Because having excess students, if your full-time position is based on a non-time-based measure, is associated with additional service, and anything that's associated with additional service should be evaluated as salary. So I'll give you an example here. So we have Tribbiani Independent Study Charter, and their contract states that full-time is a caseload of 25 students. So you'll notice it's not based on number of days, it's not based on hours, it's based on a caseload of 25 students. It's a non-time-based full-time position. The contract also states here that teachers can earn additional 4% of salary for each teacher or for each student in excess of 25. So if Joey teaches 28 students, he'll earn an additional 12% of his salary because he's going over that excess number of students. And it's associated with additional service here. I'll give you another example for the community college districts. So we have Bing CCD's contract, and they state that full-time faculty teach 12 load credits. And then the contract also states that any faculty who teach classes in excess of 50 students can earn additional load credits. So if Chandler's teaching a class with 60 students, he'll earn 1.5 load credits. This should be evaluated as salary, right? It's associated with additional service and should be evaluated as salary. Okay, let's talk about I don't see any questions, so we'll go ahead and talk about this special pay item here, performance benchmark. We're reaching the end of our special pay types. So this one is associated with payment for reaching a specific performance benchmark. And so it's really important that this one is objective and clearly laid out what the performance benchmark is. So for example, two common ones would be teacher perfect attendance and potentially increase in standardized test scores if that's the performance benchmark that's been set. For this one, this could be ongoing or limited term. Again, just depends on the contract here. Okay. So I'm going to move on and talk about reporting ongoing special pay or reporting special pay. We've talked about reporting salaries. Now let's talk about how we report these special pay items here. We'll start here by focusing on ongoing special pay. So again, these are not limited term, they're ongoing and they are considered special pay. They're not associated with any additional service. They are evaluated as special pay. So in our situation, we have Geller USD, and they're issuing a $1,000 master stipend to all teachers. Ross, who's our 2% at 60 member, and Monica, who's our 2% at 62, both are eligible and receive that payment. And it's paid each pay period of the 10-month school term. So that paid each pay period should ring some bells. You should have a feeling about who this is creditable for. But let's look at these reporting lines here. So for Ross, who's our 2% at 60, you would report using the same assignment code as salary. So in this case, assignment code 57. We have our pay rate of $100 because it's a $1,000 stipend split over the 10-month school term. It's paid each pay period, and a pay code of 0 for annual. And we'd also use contribution code 6. For Monica, we are 2% at 62. Because this is paid each pay period of that 10-month school term, it's reportable for her, which is great. So this time we have assignment code 72. Again, pay rate of $100 with that $1,000 payment split up over a 10-month school term, a pay code of 0, and using contribution code 6. Okay. Let's look at another example of ongoing special pay, but this will be a little bit different here. So in this particular case, we have, again, same school district, same stipend, $1,000 master stipend, same teachers. Ross, 2% at 60, Monica, 2% at 62. They both receive that payment. But this time it's paid in a lump sum during the May pay period. So again, should be thinking about that. We know we have Monica, who's our 2% at 62 member. So for Ross at 2% at 60, same assignment code as salary, but this time you'll notice the pay rate is $1,000, right? Because it's paid in a lump sum during that May pay period. And we're using pay code 0 and contribution code 6. For Monica, this would not be reportable because it's not paid each pay period that creditable service is performed, so therefore it's not creditable for her as a 2% at 62 member. Okay, now we've talked about ongoing special pay. Let's now talk about limited term special pay and see what that might look like. So for our limited term special pay, again, same stipend, $1,000. Same teachers, Ross at 2% at 60, Monica 2% at 62, they both receive it. The payment is paid each pay period of the 10-month school term, but the contract has one stipulation here, and that's that the payment is only available for the 2021 school year. And because this has a specific ending date, it's only paid a specific number of times just for that school year, it's going to be considered a limited term payment and therefore not reportable for 2% at 62. So let's look at what this might look like here. We have Ross 2% at 60. We're going to use assignment code 71, which is going to go straight into the DBS account because this is a limited term payment. And you'll notice that the pay rate here is $100 because it is paid over the 10-month school term. So we have $1,000 spread over those 10 months. Pay code is still 0 and contribution code 6. For Monica, in this case, we know it's a limited term payment. It's not going to be reportable for 2% at 62, so you would not report that compensation. And then the last situation I'll leave you with here is special pay, limited term. Again, same $1,000 stipend, same teachers. This time the payment is paid in a lump sum during the May pay period. The contract stipulating the payment is only available for 2021 school year. So we know it's a limited term payment. It's only paid for a specific period of time. So for Ross, our 2% at 60 member, similarly, we'll report it using assignment code 71. It'll go straight to DBS because it's a limited term payment. We're using pay code 0, but you'll notice the pay rate in this case is going to be $1,000 because it's paid in a lump sum in the May pay period. We'll also use pay code 0 and CC6, contribution code 6. For Monica, though, because it is a limited term payment, we know that we won't report this. This is not going to be creditable for her. All right, well, that was a lot of information, so I'm going to start to wrap up. But in the meantime, I'm just going to give a brief pause to see if there are any questions coming in or if anyone's typing anything out.
Leanna, I do want to add that we have some extra time.
Yeah.
So I did answer all of the questions in the chat, and I know we revisited a couple of them verbally here, but if the answer in the chat doesn't make sense to anyone or you need more clarification, please let us know, either submit a new question or at the end here, we can spend some time going over those verbally if you want to raise your hand and get some clarification on your questions that way if the answer in the chat wasn't clear.
Awesome, thanks, Megan. Okay, so it looks like there is a question that just came through. If the contract lists the master stipend at $1,000 a year, we divide and pay report as monthly. Yeah, so Victoria, look, Megan's working on that one. But yes, if it's $1,000 a year, but you pay it over the course of the school term monthly for each pay period, that would meet the 2% at 62 requirements. As long as it's not a limited term payment, right? So there were a couple of situations we saw where it's paid over the school term for each pay period, but it was only scheduled to run for one academic term or one school year. In that case, it'd be limited term, so it would not meet the requirements for 2% at 62. Okay. All right, I'm going to go. Feel free to continue putting your answers in, or your questions in the Q&A, and Megan will work on those. I'm going to wrap up a couple of final things, and then, like Megan said, we'll have some opportunities to go back and jump into some of these questions if there's anything that needs clarification. So a couple of things I'll leave you with here. And so this is just a wrap up of all those questions that we covered as we went through the presentation today. So when figuring out if compensation is creditable, consider these things. First of all, does it meet those conditions to be reportable? If it's not meeting those conditions, you know it's not going to be creditable compensation, so therefore should not be reported. If it does meet those conditions, you should ask yourself if the payment is associated with additional service. If it is, you know that it should be evaluated as salary, right? Special pay is never going to be associated with additional service. Salary is, so you'll want to evaluate that as salary. If it's not associated with additional service, then you'd want to evaluate it as special pay. If that compensation is salary, is there an annualized pay rate, or do you need to establish one using the full-time minimum standards? If the compensation is special pay, is it a limited term payment, right? Does it have a specified end date? Is it only paid a number of times? Is it not scheduled to continue? If it's a limited term payment, it's only going to be creditable for our 2% at 60 members. I want to leave you with a couple of next steps to take a look at. If you have not already been on our pension administration and learning management system, we've done a lot of really good work to organize it, to provide a lot of different resources and helpful documents, as well as computer-based trainings. And the slides for this presentation are also available on Palms as well. But some next steps to look into would be to complete the computer-based training if you need a refresher on what we've covered so far. We also have, like I said, a lot of resources on Palms. In addition, we have the job aids too that are available on the employer support portal. So definitely check those out as well. complete the course evaluation. So as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a survey at some point in the near future just to gather some feedback on your thoughts and ideas that you might have. And then there's also a knowledge check. So in our standard trainings, we usually encourage people to take the knowledge check, usually a couple of weeks usually about 2 weeks or so, just to see how much you retained from the training. So that's something to definitely take a look at as well. I'll leave it here on this slide for questions. So of course, if anything comes up, you're always welcome to contact your employer health representative, who is definitely an excellent resource. You can also submit a secure message through the Secure Messaging Center or give us a call at the number listed here. Now, one thing I will say is, as you can imagine, some of these cases can be quite complex. And so it's always helpful for us to have any duty statements or other supporting documentation so that you can receive the most accurate response. And it's difficult for CalSTRS to provide support on hypothetical situations since there are a lot of different nuances. So definitely any documentation that you might have that can support the situation and provide us with the most information allows us to give you the most up-to-date and accurate information as well. All right, so I want to thank you for your time. I know Megan and I appreciate you being here. We do have some a couple of extra minutes for questions as well. So I'll check in with Megan. How are we doing on the questions, Megan?
Good. We've gotten a couple questions about the $1,000 payment being reported in May and whether, because that pertains to the entire school year, you should report it over the entire school year. So typically that depends on whether you're reporting as earned or contractually earned, which Leanna went over a little bit earlier in the presentation. So if you consider the payment earned over the entire school year, but you wait until you issue the payment to report it, it's going to look late because it's going to look like we should have gotten monthly reporting and contributions for each month. Most employers consider the payment contractually earned when the payment is issued. So even though they're doing the work to earn that compensation over the course of the year, it's contractually earned in May. So they report it in May in the lump sum payment for the May pay period. If you go back and report it for September through May, it's going to appear late because you haven't been reporting as earned. So most employers consider those payments contractually earned when they're issued, and they report it for the pay period when the payment was issued. So I typed that out in the chat for you guys, but I hope that made sense.
Okay, thanks, Megan.
And Megan, I think there was a question in there too about providing sort of an FAQ document from the chat. Do we maybe want to address how that's going to be handled for those attendees here?
Yeah, so we will include, you'll get a separate email from the Employer Advisory Committee email box from training specifically. And Leanna will include the chat log history here for you to refer back to. She will also include links to a survey, which you can provide your very valuable feedback. And she'll also include a link to POMS, our learning management system, where you can find the slide deck for future reference, job aids, and then a bunch of our other course materials on other topics you might be interested in. So all of that will come in a separate email from Leanna after the event.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Megan.
So, as I let kind of Megan and Leanna go through these last few written questions here, I'm going to open us up for open forum. That doesn't mean that you can't ask questions on Leanna's presentation. You absolutely can, but that's where we're at in our agenda. And I've asked Leanna and Megan to stay on board if we need them for that. But if you have any questions about anything on the agenda or anything else that maybe needs to be addressed or that you'd like to speak about that wasn't on the agenda, now is the time to do that. And just to remind you, there is a raise hand feature if you want to speak in the room, or there's the Q&A, or for those of you who are on the phone, the advisory committee at CalSTRS.com email box. So I do see we have a couple of we do have a raised hand, but I also see a question from the same, so I'm going to say Naya. I'm hoping I'm not butchering your name. Let's see if we can unmute her or them.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I have a question regarding reporting longevity, master degree stipend, and special certificate. One of our districts got audited because they combine those payment into the salary as a one line, because they say this payment receive COLA increase and is included in the salary schedule. So we would like to have a clarification from STR if we can report it as a included in the salary, or we have to report it separately as a special comp.
Megan, do you want to, I know you're in the middle of typing on that one, but since it was asked out loud, do you want to maybe address it live?
Yeah, we've had that one come up a couple times in the chat. So it really depends on the salary schedule and how it's included there. So I can give you, I don't want to say yes for your specific situation, but based on the information you guys are giving me, that's how I'm answering them. So of course it always depends. But if you have a salary schedule and you kind of bake your master's stipends and those special certificates into your salary schedule, you could report that as one line. It's just salary. It's just part of salary. It's not remuneration in addition to salary. When we would want to see it separate as a CC6 or special compensation or special pay, whichever term you are using nowadays, we would expect to see that separate with contribution code 6. Either way, it gets included in the member's benefit very similarly, but there are some other instances. If it's part of the salary, it should just be reported as salary in one line if it's baked into your salary schedule. If it's not baked into your salary schedule and it's a footnote on your salary schedule, or it's a separate payment, or it's kind of an addendum somewhere else, that would be remuneration in addition to salary, and you would want to use that contribution code 6.
I see. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, we've got a bunch more popping up in the chat here. Okay, rather than have Megan go on overload answering everybody in writing, let's go ahead and just try and answer some of these live, Megan.
Yeah.
So do you want to start with Praveen's?
Yeah, so if the special pay is already part of the contract, they get future increases on it, we do not need to report separate from base pay, please verify. Yeah, so that would be the same answer that we just gave. So if it's part of the step-in column, it's part of salary, you can report it as salary in one line. If it's a separate payment, a separate, sometimes it's that footnote on the end of your step-in column, or it's referenced somewhere else in the contract, that would be remuneration paid in addition to salary, and that would need to be separate. So it really depends on how you have your salary schedule set up.
Okay, and then we have Ramona asking about excess student pay, when it would be remuneration in addition to salary.
Yes, so I will, Leanna, do you want to take that one and go over the slide? There's a couple slides on that one, so it might help for the visual.
Yeah, definitely. I will pull that up right now. I was just thinking the same thing. Okay, let's see. All right, thanks for your patience. Let me pull this up. Okay, it's loading. So generally, okay, there it goes. Okay, so generally speaking, excess students is one of the special pay, remuneration paid in addition to salary types. It usually meets that requirement. For this, it's going to be considered special pay when you have a number of students enrolled who exceeds the contractual class size maximum, and you're working with a time-based position, right? So if it's a contractual position that's time-based based on hours or days, and it's in the contract and it says if you exceed this number of students, you'll receive this amount of money, it'll be considered excess students as a special pay type. The difference would be if it's a situation where you have full-time, but it's based on a non-time based measure, which is often what we see at our community college districts, as well as some of our independent study charter type programs. If full-time is based on a non-time based measure, such as number of students, then that any additional students over that limit would count as additional work, right? It's considered additional service because it's not a time-based position. So this was an example that we talked about where full-time is a caseload of 25 students. The contract says that they'll earn additional 4% of salary for each student in excess of 25. Since the full-time is considered 25 students, if you go over that, it's considered more than full-time and excess or an additional work. But your question about when it counts as remuneration paid in addition to salary or special pay would be if we're looking at something that is time-based, which is pretty common. This is probably more common than the other for our pre-K through 12 school districts, where you have a full-time position that's time-based, and then it explicitly says in the contract what the maximum number of students is and what how much they will earn in special pay if it goes over the contractual maximum. Megan, am I missing anything for that one?
No, that's accurate. So yeah, we try not to base it on the employer type. Some people kind of generalize it to in a CCD. Excess students is going to be an additional assignment. In independent study, it's going to be an additional assignment. And in K through 12, it's going to be remuneration addition to salary. That's not necessarily the case because the law doesn't call it out by employers. It's really based on the contractual full-time and whether that's defined on a time-based measure or not, which typically in a K through 12, it's going to be based on time, and typically in a independent charter, it's based on head counts, and a CCD, it's based on load credits. So that's kind of colloquially how it's understood, but we try not to explain it that way. But if that kind of helps you conceptualize it, that works. Just remember there might be exceptions if you ever have those random community college districts or K through 12 that have their full-time based another way. And I do think actually when I think back, I think I might have answered a question. It was Teresa, I believe. I did answer Teresa. I will amend my question for your example, which was K through 12. I said you would report it as additional service. You would report it as special pay, which might be why there was a follow-up question on that. So I did make a typo in that. So I will go back and correct that answer for Teresa.
Okay, so moving on from there, we have a question from Lilia about overtime hours. Overtime hours were not reported for certificated hourly employees. I know that we didn't really, I don't think your presentation really touched on overtime too much, Leanna. So is that something you want to address, or do you want to get more details outside of the meeting?
Sounds like we might need to get more information on that one. Megan, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't. It's always best on those ones, especially if you're in a CCD setting, or that doesn't look like a CCD.
No, I think this is a charter school.
Okay. Yeah, the overtime stuff gets weird because overtime means different things to different people. And so it's just easier to have that conversation separately and make sure we're speaking about the same thing. So if you can send that one into employer help, and us or the employer help analyst can reach out to you and make sure that we're speaking the same language when we're answering that one for you.
Okay, and then Teresa actually is coming in with salary schedules with masters included in the base. I can have 2 schedules for the same class of employees is a question. And then a teacher without masters receives 60,000, but one with receives 65 on the same range and step.
Yeah, we would consider it one salary schedule because it's one class of employees. Sometimes they do get a little hairy because you have like doctorate levels and then you get all these extra columns going on. So if you're just breaking it out into 2 separate sheets of paper for simplicity, that's fine. It's still one class of employees. We would view it as one step-in column, but if it's literally 2 sheets of paper or separate documents, just because of getting all the information on one document is hard, that's fine. So that doesn't break the class of employees in other words, to create, to have master stipend built in. The law allows that pursuant to 22119.5F, 22119.2F, sorry. It's waiting for Joycelyn to correct me.
And then Dory's asking if you could please repeat the one-time payment and service period used to report the payment. I think because of the phrase that you used was contractually earned, and that differentiation there.
Yeah, so there is an employer circular. It's a couple years old now, but it's still really good information. It's current. I think it just often gets overlooked because it is several years old. But basically, the law says you have to report compensation as earned. And that can mean earned can be when you work something, that's when you earn it, or you earn it because the contract said it's paid this time. So if you're reporting a one-time payment, you're often not going back and reporting that payment for the entire school year period because it's going to look late. It's going to look like you submitted it late if you wait until it was issued to report that. Most employers consider that payment contractually earned when the contract says that it's payable, which is the month of May, the month of June, or whenever they say that they're issuing that payment. And so they would report it for that service period. And then it's reported in the lump sum for the one pay period on that pay period's monthly file. So you can certainly do it the other way if that's how you view it earned, but you would likely not be happy because it's going to look like you've failed to report a payment over, it looks like you're retroactively reporting something that you failed to report otherwise. So our recommendation is to report it the month that it was contractually earned.
And if I could just add on to that, the circular that Megan was referencing is 2018-03 paid versus earned.
Yes, and that's included in the course materials that we'll be sending out after the event.
Exactly.
I think, and I might be incorrect here in my assumption, but I think this kind of goes into this very next question that's listed here. Do we need to backdate reporting for late additional assignments, i.e. the late meeting pay form, in order to match the physical documents? For example, attended the meeting in August, paid for it in October. If they're 2% at 60, is it creditable if paid and reported in October, even though the original document shows the August date? If you backdate 2% at 62 to August when you're for the reporting, it's creditable. Any issue with treating the reporting of those two people differently? So I think we're talking there about when they are intended to be paid, right, in September, let's say, from an August meeting, but they didn't submit their documents until October.
We would need to see the payment when it was earned. So I'm going to keep going back to earned. It needs to be reported as earned or contractually earned. So if it was contractually earned in August, because that's when you were supposed to pay it, and it was contractually earned in August because that's when the service was performed. If you issued the payment late for administrative reasons or what have you, it's still late. It would still be late reporting. We would expect to see that for the August pay period. I hope that answered the question. I got a little lost in the details, but I think I got the dates right for that.
No, I think you're exactly on how I interpreted it as well. Okay, so that gets through our current list of 43 questions. I just want to say you guys are rock stars. Thank you so much, Leanna and Megan. Our employer services training group is amazing and continues to put out such amazing, wonderful, comprehensive training for our employers. So thank you so much for being here today.
Kim, can I do a quick plug?
Please.
So thank you, Leanna. This was Leanna's first employer advisory committee. So I know she was a little nervous, but you did great. So thank you, Leanna, and all the training analysts who worked on developing this module with your guys' feedback. So we actually have another module that we've redesigned as DB membership. And that's one that we're going to be kind of rolling out around the next employer advisory committee. So that'll be a new module based on feedback. Again, we're really focusing on key questions. So if you noticed, all those transition slides have those key questions that we want employers and districts to kind of be asking themselves to help them navigate themselves through some of these topics. And so Jennifer Dobbs, hopefully, will be presenting that to you guys at the next EAC, and we'll be able to get your feedback on that module as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so please remember you'll be getting a survey from Leanna through the Employer Advisory Committee email box. Please provide feedback. The only way that we can make sure that we're providing employers and you know, all of our stakeholders with the information that they need is to get feedback from you on whether or not our training is meeting your needs. I see a hand over here from Jane. Are we able to allow her to, can you please unmute yourself, Jane, and then we should be able to hear you?
Yes. 2 years ago, we came to a training at CalSTRS, and they told us to break out our stipends, which were paid lump sum for the service period that it was worked. So we've been doing that. And so for today, hearing that you're telling us that we're supposed to be reporting it when it's been, I guess, earned or paid, totally is different from what we were told 2 years ago. We do also have a lot of teachers who have additional assignments or contracts that we pay lump sum. I'm just wondering if we were to change that process again and pay it as, or report it as when it was paid. A lot of these are going to cause, I guess, errors and stirs in which, what is the error? Excessive amounts, right? There's an excessive amount error that we have during our report.
Right. Okay. So I think this is one of those situations where we're going to have you reach out to your employer help representative, because I think there's some nuances here that we are probably not that are appropriate to address in this kind of group forum. Because I do think there's a difference here between reporting something as it's paid and reporting in lump sum. So let's have you take that offline and reach out to your employer help representative. Or you can also email the employer help at CalSTRS.com box and get some more specific assistance with that.
Okay, and then just one more question.
Sure.
If we were to report it that way, in the new pension solution system, I'm just curious, is there, because according to my staff that does the reporting, another way to remove or kind of get the error cleared is if she puts approve edits. And so I'm just curious if in the new system, is there an easier way to do approve edits? Because we don't have just like 5 people that we would have to do approve edits for. It would be like, you know, maybe 500 people that we're doing it for.
So my understanding on what we currently call employer approved edits that I believe has a different terminology in the new system. I think they're warnings. And we do not have a way to group approve them. And a big part of the reason for that is because there's often different reasons for every individual as to why something might be approvable. So that is definitely, with our employer readiness group, a conversation that you can have on how best to approach that, the new file format. So they would be able to help you with that, and I can put you in touch with them. I'll make sure that I have your name, and I'll send it over with your contact information from the registration.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right. So I think we have a slide on when our next meetings will be. Thank you, Jonathan. You read my mind. And this is our upcoming schedule currently. We have at CalSTRS decided that our next 2 advisory committee meetings, so the February and May ones, will also be virtual. We're not making any decisions for the remainder of the year, but for now, you can plan that we will meet like this in February and in May. And that has been set, so I don't anticipate that changing at all. And then again, we'll be in touch on August and November as we kind of navigate through the first part of the year. And with that, I don't see any other raised hands. Joycelyn, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their participation.
Thank you so much. And all the panelists will stick around for a few minutes in case there's anyone that still has any questions that didn't get asked. But meanwhile, thank you all for being here, and we appreciate your participation.